Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, on the Progressive Radio Network, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. We've been talking about dreams recently on this show. It comes one of our main threads here, along with altered states and philosophy and various other means of gaining new perspectives on the world. And there's always the interesting side of these discussions because most of the people that I talk to are pretty interested in these things and pretty convinced that we can gain a lot on multiple levels by plunging ever further into these sort of shadow zones of consciousness, at least as they are perceived from the everyday mind. But of course, there's a dark side to these things in the realm of nightmares, which inhabit the dream, of course. And it's interesting to track a lot of dream discourse because even though people are often very positive about lucid dreaming, about the ecstasies, the information, the weirdness, the fabulous realms that one can encounter in the dream state, it's often a little less clear exactly where we put nightmares. Are nightmares a sign of pathology, of some sort of problem in the self, of landing in the wrong zone of alternate realities? Or can nightmares also be instructive? Can they be spiritual? Is there such a thing as a spiritual nightmare? I think these are really key questions, and they apply equally, if not more, to psychedelics. As you all know, psychedelics are going through quite an interesting renaissance right now, and the public discourse is changing rather strikingly in the New York Times and the New Yorker and that sort of mainstream world. Suddenly there's a much, much greater appreciation for the healing capacity, for even the scientific interest in psychedelics, how they work, what do they tell us about how the brain operates, how consciousness works. And in this move, there's often a sort of sense of the general goodness and therapeutic quality of psychedelic experience, at least in potential. There's a lot of studies, of course, that show that it can aid in end-of-life anxiety, that it possibly can help treat other sorts of depression, and the example of ketamine, et cetera, et cetera. But once again, there is this question, what do we do with the bad trip? Is the bad trip, so to speak, quote-unquote, a necessary risk? Is it something that indicates a problem in the person, a problem in the set and setting? Is it something to be avoided? Is there a spiritual bad trip? And I think these are really key questions to ask. In my case, both the question of is there a spiritual nightmare and is there a spiritual bad trip, I would have to answer with a resounding yes. In fact, I have learned things from some of my darker experiences in the other realms that have stayed with me in marvelous ways, have added an acuteness to my eye, a wariness to some of my emotional engagements of the world, and also a very strong sense of how these things can be integrated into a larger multidimensional framework rather than seen as some kind of pathology. But that my opinion is not shared by all. However, I feel like my side of the fence is being given great support by some recent work by our guest today, the illustrious Stanislav Grof, who is probably the eminence grise number one of psychedelic research in our world today, and I'm very happy that he decided to speak with me today, and particularly in the context of these new books. He has two different books, depending kind of where you are. You can get one easier than the other, but they both concern the marvelous, extraordinary artist of nightmare, H.R. Giger. So one of the books is H.R. Giger and the Zeitgeist of the 20th Century. That's a German publication. And then there's another one put out by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. And this one's called Modern Consciousness Research and the Understanding of Art, Including the Visionary World of H.R. Giger. And that second volume has a broader purview, taking in not just Giger, but a wide variety of visionary artists, both professional and personal, and looking at a kind of larger picture of how visionary art can give us an insight into the psychedelic experience. But that conversation, which we've had on the show and we'll continue to have, again raises this interesting point of what do we do with the nightmares? What do we do with the dark side? So I'm very glad that Stan's joined us. Stan, welcome to Expanding Mind. Are you there? Hello? Stan, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
There we go. Beautiful. Sometimes there's a little bit of a lag. I think the gremlins are, after our conversation, we tried to do this a few weeks ago, and the gremlins intervened. But today we'll give them a little cookie, keep them happy, and we'll have a good conversation. So anyway, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Yeah. Again, thank you for having me. This is a great pleasure for me to talk to you.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways of approaching this, in particular this question of what do we do with the nightmarish or the dark side in terms of visionary experience, and how the work of Giger, and particularly the way you address the work of Giger in terms of the perinatal matrices, which we can get to in a moment, seems very key to me. So I guess maybe one place to start is, given that there's such a wide range of so-called visionary art, that's been done in the 20th century, even the second half of the 20th century, both in terms of psychedelia or surrealism or post-surrealism. There's any number of marvelous artists, many of whom are included in your book. But for you, there's something special about Giger. And I'm curious if you could just tell personally, like when you first encountered his images and how and why you sensed that there was something special about them for you and your work.
Well, as you said, the psychedelic experiences have tremendous range, and the intensity of the experience, the emotions go far beyond the spectrum that we experience in everyday life, both in the direction of the ecstatic, of the celestial, and also in the direction of the hellish, of the demonic. So it's a tremendous spectrum, and it has nothing to do with the drugs per se. The drugs are just catalysts, and they are basically activating deep contents in our unconscious. And it is us who carry, both those very dark contents in the unconscious, or what's called the underworld of the psyche, and also the super conscious realms, the mystical, the ecstatic states. So LSD is something like a microscope of the psyche, or a telescope of the psyche. You see, it shows us certain areas which normally don't manifest very easily, except with people where this happens as part of a spontaneous process, which is then labeled as pathological rather than as emergence of contents in the unconscious, which are always there. So there's much that you can do with, as you said, set and setting. Certainly it should be done, an ideal circumstances where you are in a protected environment, where you can make sounds or, express yourself in any other way. At the same time, nobody is disturbing you from the outside. And then you had at least one or ideally two persons with you who are trained, who have experienced these states, who are not afraid of these states and can really be of support.
Yeah, what I'm getting is that the point of paying attention to set and setting, and the point of having guides or sitters who know what they're doing is not necessarily simply to avoid these more hellish experiences necessarily, but also to create a context where, if they come up, they can be engaged with in a more fruitful manner. In other words, for you, having those kinds of experiences is an important part of the range of psychedelic possibility, rather than something that is to be avoided necessarily.
Yes, if you do this work in a serious way, as self-exploration or as therapy, you don't want to avoid those dark areas, because ultimately what it means that it's a look at material in your psyche that would create problems for you in various ways in everyday life. So the negative experience is actually a tremendous opportunity, as well as it is what appears to be a crisis.
Yes, I agree. It was funny. You gave a talk recently to present the new book at a MAPS function here in San Francisco, and I was sitting with a number of people who are, seemed, I don't know them that well, but they seemed to be reasonably familiar with the issues and with the experiences, and they were all sort of looking at this, going, "Gosh, I never really have scary experiences like that. I don't know. God, is this really that?" They were sort of poo-pooing it, or kind of avoiding it, and it was very curious for me, because in my own life, but also in terms of my reading, the people I know, the stories I've heard, the stories I've been interested in, it seems like an integral part. So it seems to be an interesting dimension that not necessarily everyone winds up tuning into. So I'm curious, how would you characterize the productive or the positive aspects that can come out of these sometimes very terrifying experiences? What does one need to do to make something of it, rather than just come out going, "Oh my God, that was horrible. I never want to do that again"?
Well, you see, very much, of course, depends on the doses. Very much depends on the substance itself. So there are very few people who have bad trips with marijuana, for example, although it certainly happens. MDMA or the other substances which are amphetamine derivatives, what we call entheogens, they also tend to have, mostly positive experiences. Once you move towards LSD, towards psilocybin, mushroom, mescaline, and if the dosages are larger, then you certainly will see at least major challenging experiences, and you will see some hellish trips. I mean, there are many people who were taken to a psychiatrist or to an emergency room in the middle of a really nightmarish kind of experience, and there they did the worst thing that can be done with that kind of situation, which is giving them tranquilizers and then keeping them on maintenance dosages, which is the most effective way of preventing any kind of positive resolution. And I have seen people that 10, 20 years after that kind of experience were still hospitalized. They were on maintenance dosages, and when they tried to reduce the dosages, the experience is trying to complete itself, and it was concluded that they are still sick and that they need medication or even hospitalization.
So yeah, that's clearly a must to avoid. And then how does the work of art, or in this case particularly the images of Giger, how do they help illuminate what's going on with these more dark side realms?
Well, I came into this world in 1956, where I myself volunteered for a powerful psychedelic session, and I had an amazing mystical experience, and it generated in me a lifetime interest in these non-ordinary states. I call actually a large subgroup of these states that I believe have healing, transformative, even evolutionary potential, and also can be source of new information about the psyche, about consciousness. I call them holotropic. Holos means whole. Trapein means moving toward wholeness. So I've been particularly interested in this subcategory of non-ordinary states, which have all these positive potentials. And I came into this work equipped with traditional psychiatry and also psychoanalysis. And what I found very quickly when I started using LSD in connection with psychotherapy, that one person after another would move beyond the realm that Freud considered to be the entire psyche, which means postnatal biography, what happens to infancy and childhood, and then what he described as the individual unconscious, which is also a derivative of postnatal life. And they started moving into scary areas. For example, talking about the situation of being trapped, of being caught, of dying, or never being able to get out of there, and so on. And then when we were able to stay with those experiences, then there were situations of fighting their way out, fighting for breath, and then eventually sort of emerging into bright light, into divine light. So that entire process then had the form of psychospiritual death and rebirth, very much what you find in the initiatory experiences of the shamans, or the experiences that the shamans induce in their initiates, the kind of experiences that you see in what's called rites of passage, the very powerful rituals enacted by native cultures at the time of some important social or biological transition, the kind of experiences that were happening in the ancient mysteries of death and rebirth in Egypt, in Sumer, in Greek, in Asia Minor, in Mexico, in pre-Hispanic cultures and so on. So we were then in the realm of what was being identified as reliving of biological birth, with also openings into another vast area in the psyche that we now call transpersonal, which are sort of images that are mythological, or visits to realms which are mythological. This is a realm that Carl Gustav Jung called collective unconscious, historical or archetypal or mythological. So this is vast terrain of the psyche that can be visited in these non-ordinary states, and a significant part of our experiences which are spiritual, which are mystical, both the shadow spiritual experiences and the very, very ecstatic, very celestial, paradisian kind of experiences.
Well, I'd like to take this to split this into two different topics. One is this question of the role that the birth experience and the trauma of the birth experience play, and then there's the relationship of that to the transpersonal dimensions. And just to talk about the first part, one of the things that I really enjoy about or take a lot from the idea that the stages of the birth process stay with us as sort of archetypal processes or as primary traumas, is it seems to at once kind of confirm a Freudian approach and then push beyond it. Because on some level, you would think that even a strict Freudian, and this is a question for you, you would think that from a strictly Freudian materialist point of view, where the psyche can be boiled down to complexes and conflicts that are based in the physical reality of being babies and then little kids and dealing with family and sex and gender and all those forces, that the idea that trauma is not just something that happens when you're 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, but it's something that happens in the very moment that you're brought into the world, that would seem to be almost kind of a no-brainer. Like it would be an obvious thing for a Freudian to consider as another source of trauma. And yet in your studies, that's not the case. People are not really interested in hearing that, at least Orthodox Freudians or psychoanalysts. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you've been thinking about this for so long, how you understand the resistance to this idea that birth creates traumas that stay with us through our adult lives.
You see, this is an incredible error which completely distorts psychology and psychiatry, makes them less effective. We have just superficial understanding of where emotional psychosomatic problems are coming from, because we don't recognize the importance of the biological trauma. We don't have adequate understanding of shamanism, of rites of passage, of ancient mysteries of death, rebirth, and also religion. And we see as pathological many states that could be healing, that could be transformative. And it's very difficult for academic circles to understand why psychedelics can be that therapeutic, because they induce experiences that mainstream psychiatry consider to be psychotic. And the question is, how can you heal by inducing experiences that we consider psychotic? So the main error in psychiatry is that there's no recognition that birth is a major psychotrauma. You know, we look at birth, but we consider it pathological only if there's irreversible damage to the brain cells. But the hours of a potentially life-threatening situation in the birth canal, where the child can die, the mother can die, the child can, burn blue, be born blue, asphyxiated. They have to be resuscitated. That's not seen as trauma. And this is bizarre, because the reason that's given is that the cortex of the newborn is not myelinized, which means the neurons don't have the myelin sheets, the protective fatty sheets. Now, the same argument is not used for the importance of postnatal experiences, like this general agreement that nursing, a situation that immediately follows birth, is extremely important. And people like Marshall Klaus, obstetricians, child psychiatrists, even recognized the importance of bonding, which is the exchange, loving exchange between the mother and the child, flux after being born. So we are asked to believe that a fetus that didn't notice that something was happening when they were going 40 hours through a difficult birth situation, and that they cannot have any memory, but that instantly after birth, they respond very sensitively to look into mother's eyes and then to nuances of nursing, simply is so bizarre that it's very difficult to imagine how the psychiatric circles reconcile this kind of logical error. We also know that there's a lot of research showing tremendous sensitivity of the fetus already in the womb before the delivery even starts. We also know that you don't even need a brain to have a memory. I think 15 years ago, a Nobel Prize was given to Erik for studying memory mechanisms in a sea slug called aplysia. So sea snails can have memory, but something such a highly developed brain as a newborn could not have a memory of birth.
So this is a very interesting situation, and I know you've been facing this frustration for decades for your professional career, because you developed these ideas about the birth trauma and the different matrices associated with the birth process very early in your career, and you've watched this not really been accepted at least in the kind of mainstream psychoanalytic or Freudian, post-Freudian kind of community. Why? What is that resistance about, do you think?
Well, the only reason, I can understand that the medical profession and psychological profession reacts these ways is that the memory is so scary that we just don't want to go there. This is a major, major psychological repression, and we use our intellect, right, to explain it away. This couldn't have made any difference. My cortex was not myelinized. Well, it's a very, very weak argument that's in conflict with the daily psychotherapeutic practice in people who use some powerful experiential method, not just psychedelics, but, my wife and I developed holotropic breathwork, where you can get these experiences with faster breathing, evocative music, and certain type of body work. There is rebirthing, and, there are other methods where you can have the neo-Reichian methods that can bring these experiences into the surface. Certainly in various Aboriginal practices.
Yeah, one of the things that's so important about this idea of these different matrices, and particularly the middle two, is that they provide a way of understanding and putting into context precisely some of these nightmarish and hellish experiences that we've been talking to. So, from a spiritual point of view, someone might say, "Oh, well, I tuned into the demonic, and that, maybe because I was guilty of something," or they have, other stories to tell about why such an experience might have happened. And your ideas about birth trauma give us a very concrete place to understand the kinds of images that Giger's drawing and the kinds of experiences that many people go through. So could you talk a little bit about how the idea of the perinatal matrices help clarify what's happening to people in these sometimes nightmarish and hellish experiences?
Well, you mentioned that book that I wrote about modern art and consciousness research. That focuses on the attempts of so-called depth psychology to understand art. I show some of the attempts that Freud made, his follower Marie Bonaparte, and then showing also how it changes where you move to Jungian psychology, but that particularly what psychedelics brought into the understanding of art. And I am comparing this relatively unconvincing, superficial interpretation that came from Freud and Bonaparte, Marie Bonaparte, and how this changes when you expand the model of the psyche and you include the perinatal and you include the transpersonal. And I use specifically Giger because, if somebody doesn't see the perinatal level, the verse in Giger's art, I don't know what I could present as evidence. And I realized the other day that I, for the first time, presented this material, the perinatal theory, and also drew the 4 stages of birth that I call the basic perinatal matrices. Actually, more than 50 years ago, it was 1966 at an LSD psychotherapy conference in Amsterdam, and there's really no response. There's a tremendous response in paraprofessional circles, but minimal response in academic circles. So the other day I was making a joke. I said this must be one of the most unsuccessful historical attempts to change a paradigm.
Are you reconciled to that? Is that okay?
Well, you see, it's not just me. I mean, I now know many colleagues, and we have trained many people who do the work with holotropic breath work, and other methods, and it's just absolutely clear that domain there is there, and then our psychiatry, psychology would be grossly inadequate unless we face that. It has also tremendous implications for understanding of the situation in the world. You know, we have this very meek psychology where the worst thing that can happen to you is difficulties in nursing and toilet training, and Freud talked about seeing your parents naked, having intercourse in the bedroom, and then we are surprised when something like communism comes, the Holocaust, the Gulag Archipelago, what happened in Tibet, and they got invaded by China. What's happening in Syria? What happened in Rwanda? I mean, where is that coming from? I mean, there is a domain in the psyche which we are not willing to look at, and unless we diagnose the problem, there's very little we can do. And we now have not just the knowledge, but we have methods that can transform these energies, but they have to be experiential method. Talking is a trivial tool for dealing with experiences of this depth.
Yes, that experiential emphasis is certainly key to your work, and really what so many of us are doing in a variety of realms. But we got to take a break right now, and we'll be right back with more questions. You're listening to Expanding Mind with Erik Davis, and we're talking with Stan Grof. Back after this.
You are listening to PRN, Progressive Radio Network.
Join us Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern Time for the premiere of Women's Rights in the Workplace with Jack Tuckner. That's me, when I'll be talking with you about sex discrimination in the workplace and what you can do to protect yourself. Each week, my guests and I will discuss all forms of workplace discrimination affecting women, such as your right to maternity leave, and what you need to know about workplace sexual harassment, and what to do about that harassment if it's happening to you or to someone you love. I'll take your calls and answer your questions as well. Please tune in live on Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on prn.fm. If you miss the show live, you can listen at your convenience on prn.fm at any time. And if you like what you hear, please rate the show on iTunes.
Stay tuned to prn.fm for more empowering ideas from Progressive Voices. We're moving forward, and we hope you're coming with us.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. We're talking with Stan Grof about the reverberations of birth trauma and the transpersonal. Stan, when did you first see Giger's work, and what did it do to you when you saw it?
Well, I saw his Necronomicon, which was his first major book, and the powerful perinatal images were so impressive that I actually decided to visit him in Switzerland. I admired him very much, how courageously, he was willing to and able to portray those dark areas in the psyche. And I was aware at that time that this is the source of a lot of evil in the world, that we have these undigested traumatic experiences that we experience already coming into this world, long before, we had the traumatic experiences in childhood that has been discussed in psychology, psychotherapy.
Yeah, I mean, it was really remarkable. I've been very familiar with Giger's work. I looked at those images when I was young in the Necronomicon and others, and of course Alien. But I had never really made that connection. It's sort of remarkable looking through the images again, most of which I was familiar with in your books, how much his images underscore your argument about the perinatal matrices. I mean, it almost seems like he's almost like illustrating your theories. So it must have been quite a remarkable resonance for you to see this kind of this person who's so clearly, he's not just making these pictures up just willy-nilly. He's moving through something very deeply and profoundly. So when you met him, what was your impression? From the outside, he looks like kind of a pretty intense guy, who really, he kind of walked the walk. And a lot of fans of his work, they like it because it's so dark. Oh, I love it. Oh, it's so devilish and strange and
well, there are
challenging.
But I think three categories of people. One category, like myself, and many artists, Ernst Fuchs and Alex Gray, Salvador Dali, actually, very, very admire his courage to bring some of the dark domains of the psyche on the canvas. There are other people who cannot stand it. They sort of, ran out of the galleries, and they also blamed me. How can you publish such terrible pictures? Now, my answer was, he's a genius. He's showing us what we have to deal with to change the world. And I would rather look at the paintings in the gallery that saw the manifestations of those kinds of forces in the psyche in the evening television, where they are coming, how it manifests in the world. That to me is obscene. And then, there's also this third category, which is the Gothic culture, who respond particularly to what appears to be kind of social revolt. That he is pushing buttons of the society. They are rebellious themselves, and they find him as a representative of the kind of provocative attitude that they themselves have. But when I talked to Hans Ruedi, he told me something very interesting. He says, I don't paint these images because I indulge in them. I say, these visions scared me shitless, he said, literally, and I get some sense of command over them when I put them on the canvas, which is the same argument that Francisco Goya did. He also had these horrifying visions and, painted quite a few horrifying pictures, but he, like Hans Ruedi Giger, saw it as a self-healing.
And how did you find him as a person?
Yeah, Marie Bonaparte told about Edgar Allan Poe that had he not his art, he would have ended up in prison or in a mental institution.
So there really was a kind of a therapeutic dimension. Now, I could hear that, but I might also say, looking at the course of his work, that it's sort of he never really budged much from that zone. Would you say that in some sense and this is maybe too judgmental a term, but would you say that in some sense he was sort of stuck there?
Well, he definitely was. I actually had fantasy of running a session with him and taking him to the other side where he could use his amazing artistic ability that he had, portray some positive transcendental art with the same prowess that he was able to describe this terrible beauty of the dark side. But it never happened. Actually, he suffered from depression, and the Swiss doctors gave him opium, so he was on big, prescribed doses of opium, which I didn't think was a great therapeutic approach.
The happiest I've ever seen him in photographs is when he's riding his trains. And there's a marvelous photograph of you in one of the books, in the Maps book, where you're both riding the little trains that he had built. Could you just tell me, I'm just fascinated by that. What was this train set like, and what did that do for him? What was that about?
Well, he grew up in a small town in Switzerland called Chur, and every year they had this annual mart when they had shooting galleries and a Ferris wheel and a machine that men could hit and measure their strength. And they also had a ghost slide, and he just fell in love with it as a child. And this, I described it in the book, this whole episode. And then, as an adult, he built one through his garden and through one corner of his house. And it was basically what I would call perinatal ride. When, as you were going through dark tunnels, and you were meeting these demonic women, and there were tapestries of suffering fetuses. I have a couple of those pictures in the book. But this was pretty amazing. He had a more than life-size crocodile there stuffed, So it was an interesting, kind of a scary ride.
Yeah, it sounds like a scary ride, for sure. And then one of the questions then I can have is let's if we think about it from a more Freudian perspective, but let's say an expanded one where we say, okay, in addition to these other traumas of toilet training, etc., there's the birth trauma, and this birth trauma produces or sets up these experiences of claustrophobia, of attack, of terror, etc. What is the link between these sort of physical, emotional memories and the transpersonal? What is the link between the recapitulation of this fundamental physical trauma or mental physical trauma that the baby goes through, and the transpersonal dimensions, whether they are demonic devils or ultimately saving angels who come through? How is that connection made? How do you connect the physical the recapitulation of the physical situation with the transpersonal forces that are also such a big part of your work?
Well, you see, I was trained as a psychiatrist in a very materialistic way. I studied in Prague when we had a Marxist regime. We were controlled by the Soviet Union. And when I started using psychedelics, I thought initially that we would be just doing Freud, that we would be, dealing with things from childhood and infancy, which certainly was happening, but only initially. And then sooner or later, every single person with whom I worked moved into this perinatal level, reliving different aspects of birth. And already, when they were dealing with birth, there were also flashes of these other transpersonal experiences, archetypal experiences, past life experiences, and so on. And then at a certain point, the fetal material disappeared, and it was purely transpersonal. And so initially, I tried to explain that the transpersonal from the perinatal, because even if psychiatry doesn't accept the possibility that birth is recorded, at least there was a mature enough brain that could do that. And I felt if we see it, it's up to the physiologist to explain where it is recorded. But then as we were going further, my focus of the interpretations actually is on the archetypal. I believe that today, then, when you have a psychedelic session or a spiritual emergency, that you are tuned into the archetypal fields of the transiting planets. But this would be a whole other area. I would have to, talk about my work with Rick Tarnas, who's a brilliant astrologer, and explain how it is possible that people who have MD degrees and PhD degrees would take archetypal psychology seriously. But anyway, this I have to just summarize it, that I believe that you tune into the archetypal fields of the transiting planets, and depending on the depths of the experience, you might get something that has that archetypal quality, but is your experience from some postnatal life, or it connects you to the perinatal matrix, as I call it, that has the same archetypal quality, or you get then to the archetypal domain in the pure form, and it would be the archetypal quality that is associated with the transiting planets. Rick Tarnas wrote a phenomenal book which is called The Cosmos and Psyche. For 30 years he studied human history and showed that major events in history, like revolutions, wars, major discoveries, and so on, are systematically correlated with planetary transits. And when you read that book, it's very, very difficult to discount, the importance of these observations.
Yeah, I believe that is an impressive work of scholarship and a new way of thinking about history in a lot of ways. And one sort of way to wrap this around a little bit, we have about 10 minutes left, is I'd like to hear you reflect a little bit more about what people can do, whether we're talking about experiences encountered in holotropic breathwork, in vigil, and in dreams, or in psychedelic experiences, when these terrifying realms emerge, and what is the sort of, having seen so many people go through experiences of all these varieties, what are the sort of protocols? What's the guidance in order to deal with this material and not get swallowed up, not get stuck, not get either obsessively drawn into it or so resistant and repressive that other things start to go wrong? What is the proper way of integrating but not completely embracing this kind of material?
Well, if you look at human history, okay, you will find out that just about every culture, without exception, held these what I call holotropic states, non-ordinary states, in great respect. They spent a lot of time trying to find safe and effective ways of inducing them. They use them for their ritual, spiritual life. They use them for cultivating intuition, for inspiration for their art, even for practical things like finding lost people or lost objects. And there's tremendous anthropological literature about this that has been confirmed. Now, we are the only group, and I'm talking about the industrial civilization, that doesn't have any use for these states. We have rejected them. We have even outlawed some of the means and some of the context. And, we're paying a big price in having lost really useful experiential spirituality. And it has to have implications for how we treat nature, the ecological destruction, the alienation that we experience with our bodies, with ourselves, with nature, with the divine. So this is a very different situation from the one that you had in native cultures. When they had rituals, for example, in puberty rituals, the people, the initiates, would have experiences that bring them to the worldview of the culture. In other words, they make them more useful members of those tribes. Whereas what happened here in a kind of an atheistic, monistic, materialistic society, when in the 60s people started having these experiences, they actually alienated themselves because they could not accept how we live. our hierarchy of values, the enormous amount of money that goes into killing, what we do with nature, and so on. It's a question of whether the culture itself and the profession is open and is knowledgeable about these states and can provide encouragement and support.
Right. So now you've been working on this for a long time, right? This is your whole life. You've been around for a while, and you saw this potential in the 60s already. You could see the way that Western society would come to accept these other dimensions, these other kinds of practices, reintegrate, and perhaps heal some of the pathologies of modern civilization. Needless to say, we're not exactly there. However, if you do reflect on all of these decades and the potential that's still there, how are we doing? Are we doing terribly? Are we doing okay? Is there hope? Does it seem like a perpetual frustration, or do you see things changing?
Well, it doesn't look good, does it? I mean, malignant aggression and an incredible greed has been something that has been with us since the beginning of history. But we have now enormously powerful means of destruction. And also that the greed is now destroying the planet. We are plundering non-renewable resources, fossil fuels, coal, oil, and we are turning it into pollution, which is the last thing that a biological entity needs. So you think we are, if you extend that trajectory, we might destroy ourselves. We might destroy the planet. We might destroy life. Or if we turn inside and we go through some these processes of transformation, which we already know exist, we might actually move to another level of evolution. We might get to the point that we deserve the name that we have given our species, Homo sapiens sapiens. So far, we have not been really acting as wise humanity.
What do you see any signs? When you were putting together this book, Modern Consciousness Research and the Understanding of Art, you look through a lot of visionary art, not especially contemporary images as well. Do you have a sense, or did you come away with certain impressions about the kinds of images that people are making, recently? Not just Alex Gray, but many of the younger artists who have come along. Some sense of what was changing in the imagery, or a sense of a different kind of wave or sensibility of dealing with the imaginary that you noticed in some of these younger artists?
Yeah, this is a fascinating phenomenon that really gives me hope, and that is if you look at the experiences that people have with psychedelics and also paint, they are all over the place. In other words, it seems like the collective unconscious is open. I had myself experiences which were Buddhist, which were Hindus, which were Christian, Australian Aborigines, Shinto, Greek, you name it. Now, this has to be a new phenomenon because the ancient cultures had powerful mind-expanding means, and at the same time they seem to go specifically to their mythologies, the Greeks into Greek mythology, the Tibetans into Tibetan mythology. And this is not happening anymore. And it seems to parallel what's happening on the surface of the planet. You see, until the 50s, Tibet was really secluded. Maybe Alexandra David Neal and Lama Govinda were the culture brokers. But then, in the last decades now, there are Tibetans all over the world. There are ashrams all over the world. All the different scriptures of different cultures are available. Recorded music of different spiritual systems. And then, the exchange between cultures. You have, for example, the internet as the last straw. So there seems to be some kind of a development toward a global civilization in spite of all the terrible things that we see, that is happening on the surface, but also a radical opening of the collective unconscious. We are getting access to the archetypal heritage of different cultures.
Yeah, absolutely, and of course the nightmares are there as well. I mean, the ability for modern media to create these spaces is really extraordinary. And I guess we have very very little time yet. I was about to ask you a very large question, but I'm gonna do it anyway, even though we only have a couple of minutes. Which is when dealing with these forces, and particularly the kinds of gods or entities that people encounter in their experiences, we can look at them as metaphors or images for psychic processes, for things inside of ourselves, and then some people prefer to look at them as external agents that are more or less accurately representing themselves in the vision. You've spent so much time looking at this in your own life and in the lives of so many people. What do you think is the best approach?
Well, I agree with Aldous Huxley, who had some experiences with mescaline and LSD, and he wrote this wonderful little booklet, which was called Heaven and Hell, where he said, heaven, the angels, hell, the devils, the purgatory, they are all real, but they have nothing to do with the world in which we live. They don't compete, you see, for the world that we experience, but are something that we experience in non-ordinary states of consciousness. In other words, they are intrapsychic in that sense. We might experience them as being outside, but ultimately they are accessed by going into our own psyche. They are intrapsychic phenomena.
Well, wonderful, Stan. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. Once again, Stan Grof, the book is Modern Consciousness Research and the Understanding of Art, put out by MAPS, and it's full of wonderful images as well as a very clear explanation of Grof's theories about birth trauma. Stan, thanks so much for joining me on Expanding Mind.
I thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the program. I think it's very, very important to provide this information for people.
Wonderful. Okay, folks, let's see, next week we're going to be talking to some people doing a Salvia Divinorum documentary, so tune in, and until then, keep your minds open.